Paganism is a term that developed among the Christian community of southern Europe during late antiquity to describe religions other than their own. Judaism, or Islam, the three Abrahamic religions. Throughout Christendom, it continued to be used, typically in a derogatory sense. In the 19th century, it was re-adopted as a self-descriptor by members of various artistic groups inspired by the ancient world. In the 20th century, it came to be applied as a self-description by practitioners of contemporary pagan, or neo-pagan, religious movements. There has been much scholarly argument as to the origin of the term paganism. Paganism has also been understood by some to mean any non-Abrahamic religions, but this is generally seen as insulting by adherents of those religions. While paganism is often considered to exclude monotheism and to express a worldview that is pantheistic, polytheistic, or animistic, there are some monotheistic pagans. Once monotheistic religions, such as Christianity and Islam, started to become more prominent, names to encompass polytheistic worshippers started to develop. Some of these include Hellene, pagan, and heathen, and at times these names were used as slurs. Modern knowledge of old pagan religions comes from several sources, including anthropological field research records, the evidence of archaeological artifacts, and the historical accounts of ancient writers regarding cultures known to the classical world. Before the rise of monotheistic religions, most people practiced some type of polytheism. Many of these religions started to die out, and eventually they became extinct. In some cases, elements of polytheistic belief systems continued to exist in folklore. Paganism would later be studied during the Renaissance and Romantic era. Forms of these religions, influenced by various historical pagan beliefs of pre-modern Europe, exist today and are known as contemporary or modern paganism, also referred to as neo-paganism. Nomenclature and etymology. Pagan, the adoption of paganus by the Latin Christians as an all-embracing, pejorative term for polytheists, represents an unforeseen and singularly long-lasting victory within a religious group, of a word of Latin slang originally devoid of religious meaning. The evolution occurred only in the Latin West, and in connection with the Latin Church. Elsewhere, Hellene, or Gentile, remained the word for pagan, and paganos continued as a purely secular term, with overtones of the inferior in the commonplace. Peter Brown, Late Antiquity, 1999. It is crucial to stress right from the start that until the 20th century people did not call themselves pagans to describe the religion they practiced. The notion of paganism, as it is generally understood today, was created by the early Christian Church. It was a label that Christians applied to others, one of the antitheses that were central to the process of Christian self-definition. As such, throughout history it was generally used in a derogatory sense. Owen Davies, 2011. There has been considerably scholarly debate as to the origins of the term paganism. The term pagan is from late Latin, wikt, paganus, revived during the Renaissance, itself deriving from Classical Latin, wikt, pagus, which originally meant region delimited by markers. Paganus had also come to mean of or relating to the countryside, country dweller, villager, by extension, rustic, unlearned, jocal, bumpkin, in Roman military jargon, non-combatant, civilian, unskilled soldier. It is related to wikt, panga, and ultimately comes from Proto-Indo-European *pag. Medieval writers often assumed paganus as a religious term was a result of the conversion patterns during the Christianization of Europe, where people in towns and cities were converted more readily than those in remote regions, where old ways lingered. However, this idea has multiple problems. First, the word's usage as a reference to non-Christians predates that period in history. Second, paganism within the Roman Empire centered on cities. The concept of an urban Christianity as opposed to a rural paganism would not have occurred to Romans during early Christianity. Third, unlike words such as rusticitas, paganus had not yet fully acquired the meanings used to explain why it would have been applied to pagans. Paganus more likely acquired its meaning in Christian nomenclature via Roman military jargon. Early Christians adopted military motifs and saw themselves as militares Christi. A good example of Christians still using paganus in a military context rather than religious is in Tertullian's De Corona Militis v. where Christians are referred to as paganus. Paganus acquired its religious connotations by the mid-4th century. As early as the 5th century, paganos was metaphorically used to denote persons outside the bounds of the Christian community. Following the sack of Rome by pagan Visigoths just over 15 years after the Christian persecution of paganism under Theodosius I, murmurs began to spread that the old gods had taken greater care of the city than the Christian God. In response, Augustine of Hippo wrote De Civitate Dei contra Paganos. In it, he contrasted the fallen city of man to the city of God, of which all Christians were ultimately citizens. Hence, the foreign invaders were not of the city, or rural. The term pagan is not attested in the English language until the 17th century. In addition to infidel and heretic, it was used as one of several pejorative Christian counterparts to Gentile as used in Judaism, and to kafir and mushrik as in Islam. Hellene. For more details on this topic, see Hellene comes to mean pagan. In the Latin-speaking Western Roman Empire of the newly Christianizing Roman Empire, Koine Greek became associated with the traditional polytheistic religion of ancient Greece, and regarded as a foreign language in the West. By the latter half of the 4th century in the Greek-speaking Eastern Empire, pagans were, paradoxically, most commonly called Hellenes. The word almost entirely ceased being used in a cultural sense. It retained that meaning for roughly the first millennium of Christianity. This was influenced by Christianity's early membership, who were Jewish. Jews of the time distinguished themselves from foreigners according to religion rather than ethno-cultural standards, and early Jewish Christians would have done the same. As Hellenic culture was the dominant pagan culture in the Roman East, they called pagans Hellene. Christianity inherited Jewish terminology for non-Jews and adapted it to refer to non-Christians they were in contact with. This usage is recorded in the New Testament. In the Pauline epistles, Hellene is almost always juxtaposed to Hebrew in disregard of actual ethnicities. Usage of Hellene as a religious term was initially part of an exclusively Christian's nomenclature, but some pagans began defiantly calling themselves Hellenes. Other pagans even preferred the narrowed meaning of the word, from a broad cultural sphere to a more specific religious grouping. However, there were many Christians and pagans alike who strongly objected to the evolution of the terminology. The influential Archbishop of Constantinople Gregory of Nazianzus, for example, took offense to imperial efforts to suppress Hellenic culture and openly criticized the emperor. The growing religious stigmatization of Hellenism had a chilling effect on Hellenic culture by the late 4th century. By late antiquity, however, it was possible to speak Greek as a primary language while not conceiving of oneself a Hellene. The long-established use of Greek in and around the Eastern Roman Empire, a lingua franca, ironically allowed it to instead become central in enabling the spread of Christianity, as indicated for example by the use of Greek for the epistles of Paul. In the first half of the 5th century, Greek was the standard language in which bishops communicated, and the Acta Conciliorum were recorded originally in Greek and then translated into other languages. Heathen. Heathen comes from Old English heathen, cf. Old Norse heathen. This meaning for the term originated from Gothic heithno being used to translate Hellene in Wulfila's Bible, the first translation of the Bible into a Germanic language. This may have been influenced by the Greek and Latin terminology of the time used for pagans. If so, it may be derived from Gothic Hythe. However, this is not attested. It may even be a borrowing of Greek theta nu omicron sigma, via Armenian heathanos. The term has recently been revived in the forms heathenry and heathenism, alternatives names for the Germanic neo-paganism movement, adherents to which may self-identify as heathens. Definition: it is perhaps misleading even to say that there was such a religion as paganism at the beginning of the Common Era. It might be less confusing to say that the pagans, before their competition with Christianity, had no religion at all in the sense in which that word is normally used today. They had no tradition of discourse about ritual or religious matters, no organized system of beliefs to which they were asked to commit themselves, no authority structure peculiar to the religious area, above all no commitment to a particular group of people or set of ideas other than their family and political context. If this is the right view of pagan life, it follows that we should look on paganism quite simply as a religion invented in the course of the 2nd to 3rd centuries AD, in competition and interaction with Christians, Jews and others. North 1992, 187-88, defining paganism as problematic. Understanding the context of its associated terminology is important. Early Christians referred to the diverse array of cults around them as a single group for reasons of convenience and rhetoric, while paganism generally implies polytheism. The primary distinction between classical pagans and Christians was not one of monotheism versus polytheism. Not all pagans were strictly polytheist. Throughout history, many of them believed in a supreme deity. To Christians, the most important distinction was whether or not someone worshipped the one true God. Those who did not were outsiders to the church and thus pagan. Similarly, classical pagans would have found it peculiar to distinguish groups by the number of deities followers venerate. They would have considered the priestly colleges and cult practices more meaningful distinctions. Referring to paganism as pre-Christian indigenous religions is equally untenable. Not all historical pagan traditions were pre-Christian or indigenous to their places of worship, owing to the history of its nomenclature. Paganism traditionally encompasses the collective pre- and non-Christian cultures in and around the classical world, including those of the Greco-Roman, Celtic, Germanic, Slavic tribes. However, modern parlance of folklorists and contemporary pagans in particular has extended the original four-millennia scope used by early Christians to include similar religious traditions stretching far into prehistory. Perception. Paganism came to be equated by Christians with a sense of hedonism, representing those who are sensual, materialistic, self-indulgent, unconcerned with the future, and uninterested in sophisticated religion. Pagans were usually described within this worldly stereotype, especially among those drawing attention to what they perceived as the limitations of paganism. Thus G. K. Chesterton wrote, "The pagan set out, with admirable sense, to enjoy himself. By the end of his civilization he had discovered that a man cannot enjoy himself and continue to enjoy anything else." In sharp contrast, Swinburne the poet would comment on this same theme, "Thou hast conquered, O pale Galilean, the world has grown grey from thy breath, we have drunken of things Lethean, and fed on the fullness of death." History. Bronze Age to Early Iron Age religions of the ancient Near East, ancient Egyptian religion, ancient Semitic religion, ancient Mesopotamian religion. Classical antiquity. Ludwig Feuerbach defined the paganism of classical antiquity, which he termed Heidentum, as the unity of religion and politics, of spirit and nature, of God and man, qualified by the observation that man in the pagan view is always defined by ethnicity, i.e., Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Jew, etc., so that each pagan tradition is also a national tradition. Modern historians define paganism instead as the aggregate of cult acts, set within a civic rather than a national context. without a written creed or sense of orthodoxy. Late antiquity and Christianization. The developments in the religious thought of the far-flung Roman Empire during late antiquity needs to be addressed separately, because this is the context in which early Christianity itself developed as one of several monotheistic cults, and it was in this period that the concept of pagan developed in the first place. As Christianity emerged from Second Temple Judaism, it stood in competition with other religions advocating pagan monotheism, including the cult of Dionysus, Neoplatonism, Mithraism, Gnosticism, and Manichaeanism. Dionysus in particular exhibits significant parallels with Christ, so that numerous scholars have concluded that the recasting of Jesus, the wandering rabbi, and the image of Christ, the Logos, the divine Savior, reflects the cult of Dionysus directly. They point to the symbolism of wine and the importance it held in the mythology surrounding both Dionysus and Jesus Christ. Wick argues that the use of wine symbolism in the Gospel of John, including the story of the marriage at Cana at which Jesus turns water into wine, was intended to show Jesus as superior to Dionysus. The scene in the Bacchae wherein Dionysus appears before King Pentheus on charges of claiming divinity is compared to the New Testament scene of Jesus being interrogated by Pontius Pilate. Mohammedan Islamization in Arabia. Most Arabic pagans became virtually extinct during Muhammad's era by way of Islamization. The sacred months of the Arab pagans were the 1st, 7th, 11th and 12th months of the Islamic calendar. After Muhammad had conquered Mecca, he set out to convert the pagans. One of the last military campaigns that Muhammad ordered against the Arab pagans was the demolition of Dul-Khalazar. It occurred in April and May 632 AD, in 10AH of the Islamic calendar. Dul-Khalazar is referred to as both an idol and a temple, and it was known by some as the Kaaba of Yemen, built and worshipped by pagan tribes. Early modern period interest in pagan traditions was revived in the Renaissance, at first in Renaissance magic as a revival of Greco-Roman magic. In the 17th century, description of paganism turned from the theological aspect to the ethnological, and a religion began to be understood as part of the ethnic identity of a people, and the study of the religions of primitive peoples triggered questions as to the ultimate historical origin of religion. Thus, Nicolas Fabry de Peresque saw the pagan religions of Africa of his day as relics that were in principle capable of shedding light on the historical paganism of classical antiquity. Romanticism. Paganism resurfaces as a topic of fascination in 18th to 19th century Romanticism, in particular in the context of the literary Celtic and Viking revivals, which portrayed historical Celtic and Germanic polytheists as noble savages. The 19th century also saw much scholarly interest in the reconstruction of pagan mythology from folklore or fairy tales. This was notably attempted by the brothers Grimm, especially Jacob Grimm in his Teutonic mythology, and Elias Lonrot with the compilation of the Kalevala. The work of the brothers Grimm influenced other collectors, both inspiring them to collect tales and leading them to similarly believe that the fairy tales of a country were particularly representative of it, to the neglect of cross-cultural influence. Among those influenced were the Russian Alexander Afanasiev, the Norwegians Peter Christian Asbjørnsen and Jorgen Moe, and the Englishman Joseph Jacobs. Romanticist interest in non-classical antiquity coincided with the rise of Romantic nationalism and the rise of the nation-state in the context of the 1848 revolutions, leading to the creation of national epics and national myths for the various newly formed states. Pagan or folkloric topics were also common in the musical nationalism of the period.